Meanwhile, by a cleft between two walls of rock, following a path worn by a torrent, and which, in all human probability, human foot had never before trod, Dante approached the spot where he supposed the grottos must have existed. Keeping along the shore, and examining the smallest object with serious attention, he thought he could trace, on certain rocks, marks made by the hand of man. Time, which encrusts all physical substances with its mossy mantle, as it invests all things of the mind with forgetfulness, seemed to have respected these signs, which apparently had been made with some degree of regularity, and probably with a definite purpose. Occasionally, the marks were hidden under tufts of myrtle, which spread into large bushes laden with blossoms, or beneath parasitical lichen, so Edmond had to separate the branches or brush away the moss to know where the guide marks were. The sight of marks renewed Edmond's fondest hopes. Might it not have been the cardinal himself who had first traced them, in order that they might serve as a guide for his nephew in the event of a catastrophe, which he could not foresee would have been so complete? This solitary place was precisely suited to the requirements of a man desirous of burying treasure. Only, might not these betraying marks have attracted other eyes than those for whom they were made, and had the dark and wondrous island indeed faithfully guarded its precious secret? It seemed, however, to Edmond, who was hidden from his comrades by the inequalities of the ground, that at 60 paces from the harbor the marks ceased, nor did they terminate at any grotto. A large, round rock, placed solidly on its base, was the only spot to which they seemed to lead. Edmond concluded that perhaps, instead of having reached the end of the route, he had only explored its beginning, and he therefore turned round and retraced his steps. The treasure hunt begins in earnest. I'm surprised it took me this long into the show to mention this, but think what you will about the History Channel. It's got its pros, it's got its cons. Does it stoke conspiratorial thinking in some of its shows? Yes, incredibly so, to maybe a negligent and dangerous degree. Are there some shows on there that display human ingenuity and an integrity of mission? Yes, I think there are those as well. And I have to admit, I do watch The Curse of Oak Island. It started as a way to bond with my dad. He watched it. He got me into it. And I, like the people on that show, became enamored with the idea of the mystery there. For those of you that aren't familiar, the long story, very short, is that there's an island off the coast of Nova Scotia that supposedly houses a treasure of some sort underneath layers and layers, like hundreds of feet of earth, with these traps to help guard it even further. And by traps, I mean like water channels that would flood the treasure chambers, if that is in fact what they are. The show is on its 10th season. They dig, they excavate, they have archaeologists, they do scanning, they go through pretty much every modern technique for treasure hunting. But why I mention it now is that in this passage, Dante is following handmade markers on things that would stand the test of time. So markings on rock and places that would not betray the intent of the person who buried the treasure for it to be found under specific instructions later on. As Dante says here, Spada to his nephew. And now, unknowingly to Spada to Dante, through his nephew to Faria to Dante. So he's following these markers, and this is something that is depicted in The Curse of Oak Island. Now, they haven't definitively connected, the markings that they're finding on the island to real world things. There's a lot of speculation. They have to continue the show, season after season. So I'm sure even if they did come up with something definitive, they would put a little question mark around it just to make sure that they can continue to ask questions until they decide to end the show. But I find that kind of interesting in that, even in 1844, this idea of treasure hunting and the way that you would bury a treasure hasn't changed much. And in fact, what they're searching for on the Curse of Oak Island would have been buried, uh, maybe not at the time the treasure would have been buried in this story, because that was what, in the 1600s. I can't remember when Spada died. 1700s. But the time at which this was written would have been around the time that there began to be treasure hunting on Oak Island, and that the treasure might have been whisked away in the 1600s or 1700s. So maybe it does line up pretty similarly with this story. I think it's just another example of Dumas pulling from the real world, methodologies, things he would be learning. Like, it's proving that Dumas is doing his research. This isn't a, tattered parchment showing, a dotted line going to an X marks the spot. This is a story passed through a single fragmented artifact that has given word of mouth instructions on where to find this treasure, and that feels much more real than the Bugs Bunny version of this, where they're following a cryptic map with clues on it of like, oh, the rock that looks like a face. I think they did that in the second City Slickers. But let's talk a little bit about Dante here as well, because there's a dual thing happening here. One is he has the hope, he has belief again, like these markers, he's seeing that like Faria might not have been completely out of his mind, because there is something in the place that he said it would be. He doesn't know that it's leading to the thing that, Faria was proclaiming, but it gives him hope. And so he has belief and hope again. However, it's intermingled with this lack of trust, this suspicion, this need for isolation and aloneness to uncover it. He has to be separate from his shipmates in order to do this. He doesn't trust them enough to bring them in on the discovery. He wants to hold on to this for himself. There's something to unpack there about why Dante would want to do that based on everything we know of him and his situation leading up to this. Why does he continue to choose distrust? Has his trust in the world been so broken by his wrongful imprisonment that it has changed him as a character for continuing to distrust even those who demonstrate outward trust for him, the way that Jacopo is doing? And of course, the last thing I think I want to mention is just the reminder that this was a serialized story. And there's something about this sequence in particular that really reminded me of like the 1940s and 50s movie serials. You would go to a theater and you would get a 10-minute reel, a single reel of a continuing story like Dick Tracy or Batman or Buck Rogers, and you'd have to leave on a cliffhanger so that, it would draw you into the theater the next time the next installment was playing. This very much is that serialized nature where it's like, okay, we are creating suspense through the slight revelation of clues to keep readers invested week to week and sell more magazines. So I just don't want to ever lose sight of that, because we are reading it as one tome. In fact, we're not, though. I just realized that this podcast is like, okay, hold on. This just broke my brain a minute. So the initial story was serialized. I should do some research on where those serialization breaks are. And I'll try to look that up after this. But then it was compiled into a single tome, which is how most people encounter it now. But we are kind of going in the opposite direction. We're not reading it as a single tome. We're serializing it even further than it was intended to be. That's weird and absurd. And I guess that's baked into the show, so I shouldn't be too surprised. I'd be curious, what do you get out of this like hyper serialization that you wouldn't get if you had read it straight through? You can reach out to me in the Discord. The link is in the show notes on every episode. So please join me there. I'm curious what your experience with this way of reading the story is. But let's continue tomorrow to see what Dante uncovers further. Until then, you know where to find me, right here. Okay, goodbye. The Countdown of Monte Cristo is part of the Gruntwork Podcast Network. This show is produced, edited, and hosted by Landon Solano. The original text of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Theme song by Magic Solo. If you want to support the show and others like it, visit patreon.com/gruntworkpod. Thank you for listening. See you tomorrow.